about just where they see continuous delivery, what are they doing, and what's their maturity model. So I'll go ahead and get started. Yeah, we can talk about that stuff, Ian, for sure. So thank you everybody for coming to the Continuous Delivery Foundation webinar. I'm Ravi Lachhman, I'll be the host, one of the hosts today. So I'll be talking about continuous delivery insights, common challenges in continuous delivery. Also, I'm part of the CDF Speakers Bureau, always excited to talk about all sorts of things that continuous delivery related or unrelated. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in. If you have just any thoughts, love to talk to people. And I find myself talking all the time. Go forward. A little bit about myself. So Ravi Lachhman, most of my background's been in distributed systems. I like to build and break things. I had several high profile incidents. I was getting outages before there was blameless culture. So I definitely got blamed for a lot of stuff. But currently I work for Harness. I'm on their evangelism team. Prior, I worked for AppDynamics, and then most of my career has been building big Java-based systems. So I was at Mesosphere, Red Hat, and IBM. And with all of this experience, I've got to see how a lot of people got to deploy software and just some challenges of what we see. And so this is 1 minute on who is Harness. So Harness, we're this canary in the middle here. So Harness is a continuous delivery as a service platform. And so we help orchestrate a few things. We help orchestrate your releases, we help orchestrate your confidence building exercises, and we help orchestrate your approvals. So we do all of this as a service. But let's go ahead and get started. So a part of what we do at Harness is when we look talking to potential prospects or customers or anybody in between, we really do something called we do a capability assessment and take a look at the maturity model where people have on their continuous delivery, let's say maturity model. Now, with the business term maturity model, right, it's always very subjective, right? Like this is where I'm kind of going off script a little bit. It's, you don't know how mature you are until you start benchmarking against other people, like where the pundits kind of come in if you read Lean Enterprise or if you read some other type of benchmarking type of study. A lot of times if you have to put yourself like where the authors of those particular books are, until they get a good corpus of like interviewing people, they don't have a range to take a look at, hey, this is the low part of the range and this is the high part of the range. Because you're coming in really objectively to this type of conversation, saying, okay, just tell us what you have, right? So when we typically interview customers, we take the same tack, right? Like, hey, there's no right or wrong answer to this. Everybody does things a little bit differently. Yeah, we definitely, and like, yeah, we don't want to be on the Phoenix project. It gives me like nightmares. It reminds me of time I spent at Boeing. Like, but yeah, you also try not to be on the Unicorn project, right? Like, hey, those two pieces of literature are fictional, but they hit home really closely to folks. And so what we typically run is something called a CDCA, a continuous delivery capability assessment. And so what we do, we take a look at a prospect or customer's current process. We look at common tools and then we just interview them a level of effort, right? So we're not dinging them on like, oh, you're only deploying once a day. You're not deploying 5 times a day. You're deploying once every couple months. And I'll share those findings, what we've seen over 100 organizations. But we're really helping to build this capability assessments and making sure that, hey, this is a set of corpus of data that we have. So we all wrap this up in a book, actually. So you're getting the abridged version of the book, so I can talk through it. So it's called Continuous Delivery Insights 2020. We have a blog post in the CDCF kind of going through a handful of the findings. Also at the end of the webinar, I have a link. So if you want to download it, feel free to take a look at it. We kind of get the findings I'm going to talk about today are more level of effort type of things. In the Continuous Delivery Insights 2020, there's more tooling centric stuff. So like, hey, this many people were using Jenkins for CI, or this many people we talked to use some sort of like ticketing or management type of application when going through the process. But I'll spare you for those details today. So the very first question, if you were totally green to continuous delivery, you actually might do a Google search like this, right? You might have Lean Enterprise. I'm sorry, like you would have a copy of Lean Enterprise in one hand, and you might flip through it and like, oh, let me go to Google to make sure that we're doing it correctly, right? Like how many times has Amazon deployed? Google answer will come up saying every 11.7 seconds. You might look at yourself like, oh boy. well, we're certainly not deploying every 11.7 seconds. That's certainly an outlier, right? With how the amount of time that people take to deploy. But I call this like fear of deploying or fear of missing out if you hear about FOMO, right? If you're not doing it like the best industries, you're not there, right? The pundits tell you that you need to be doing more and you're not there. Hey, don't worry. Like you're not alone in this. In fact, a bulk share of people deploy a lot less than this. And going back to, if you were flipping through, this actually is a image from the Lean Enterprise again. Sorry, Jez. Like this is an image from the Lean Enterprise. And so if you were to take a look at this, clearly like as a person, you might want to be all the way to the right. You know what? We want to make sure that we're enabled to the right. So for us to get to 100 releases a day, that's still less than every 11.7 seconds. We need some sort of GitOps or pull request based development. We also need particular ways of packaging, particular ways of, everybody can talk, yeah, for sure. Like we need particular ways of having discoverability. We need particular ways of like releasing, right? Some sort of release strategy, such as a Bluebeam or Canary. And then also you have the ability to self-service. Cool, like those are all like great aspirational goals to get to, but being realistically, the folks on the phone, your enterprise the best, your organization the best, and sometimes the paradigm doesn't really meet the requirements. So, okay, first question. So how much did we see organizations deploy? Well, if the picture didn't give it away, we saw out of 100 organizations, we saw a bulk share of organizations deploy every 2 weeks. Now, this is to a production-based system, right? So in my background, way back in the day, I used to work for an investment bank, and so like even before the product companies, and so like we would typically build and deploy to like a QA or a lower environment, like a dev int environment every day. But we would typically be going into production like once a month, unless there was an emergency, right? Then we had a break fix, or there's some sort of like security vulnerability or emergency scenario which would bypass our change management process. But typically we've seen every 2 weeks, right? There's bi-weekly releases that industry tends to use. We see at least about 50 percentile is on the bi-weekly. Going into, depending who we talk to. Now, some of the data might be a little bit more aggressive because by the time we're talking to an organization, they already have an interest in doing continuous delivery, right? So like we had organizations that deploy every 6 months as an outlier, had people who deployed every multiple times a day. But on average, for people who are looking to be kind of like a turning point, like hey, we're more focused on it, really looking at that bi-monthly release, so twice a month into production. And so the next part is, how hard is it actually to deploy? And this is actually a very interesting perspective to have. There's clearly like the literal time it takes to deploy something. Oh, you know what? The application takes 2.5 minutes to start, and first to package something and to get to part of the cluster takes another couple minutes. No, that's as objective as that is. There's a lot of steps that are required to kind of lead you up to it, right? So like when you're looking at how hard it is to deploy, we call this toil. There's multiple people involved, right? Taking it from the top going down, like there's folks who you have to give approvals to. Also, like let's say, this is actually a very, very good sized group here. Let's say all several of us are on a team. Most likely, each one of us would have to touch, if we had different roles, we have a release engineer, we have a DevOps engineer, we have a couple people in the dev team, might have an SDET type position. Each one of us would touch it. And we've seen that the average amount of time, total totality from the time we said, okay, this is ready to deploy. So as a developer, I'm saying, okay, cool. We noticed that the amount of time that it actually takes is 2.5 weeks, or not 2.5 weeks, it's half a week, sorry. I was trying to do the math like a dog because I was trying to times that by 7. So this poor, if it's half a week in human years, times that by 7 for this poor dog here to go through. But yeah, for the time I say, okay, let's say like Monday, I was like, let's do it. It'll be like Wednesday before it actually gets deployed, because again, the number of resources we have to get together, the amount of testing that we have to do. And so it starts to be very expensive, right? So if you start boiling into that bi-weekly deployment, you're typically spending, a week out of that month, just total preparation, getting all the team together, lining up all the tickets, making sure that people agree, making sure the test suites run, making sure that the regression test suites run. That really takes a long time. and just going back to it again, like total effort to get the prod. If it's Monday, we're going to be on what our camel says hump day here. It'll be Wednesday, right? By the time you get to deploy. Now, usually what ends up happening, it's not sequential, right? Like, given there's Marcus and Ian on the call, so like we can have a multiplier effect because 1 hour total time that's elapsed is actually 4 hours for us. There's four, let's say, or including Jacqueline, so it's 5 engineers. We're making that quicker, but again, in total like pure hours, it'll be about 20 to 25 hours of pure work. So divide that by us, we might be able to get everything out in a day, but still it's a dedication to us all running on the same effort, right? And so one of the core, let's say, pillars of a continuous delivery, you might hear this term called a Canary deployment. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Canary deployment, I'm using a Canary and a chunky otter here, as this is my version of a Canary deployment. So the users are tacos, the load balancers are the traffic lights. And basically with the Canary-based approach, let's say the Canary is version 1 of an application and the chunky otter is a version 1.1. At some point, you're making a switch, right? So it's a safety mechanism. You're able to build confidence a little bit quicker. And so with that, you're able to say, hey, you know what? In theory, it seems simple, right? Like, oh yeah, we have one version, we swap the other version, and we keep swapping the versions until the Canary or version 1.1 has completed the entire transition. But there is a lot of difficulty. So over the 100 customers and prospects we talk to, ironically, only 4% of them leverage a Canary deployment, at least somewhere in their organization. So again, I might be limited to we're talking to a specific team. We might be some organizations where we might be talking to a DevOps or platform engineering team, and so they might have a wider purview. But if we aggregate all the teams we talk to, only about 4% of folks said yes, we use a Canary. So let's talk about why that's the case. Let's go back to the Canary here. So when we replace Mr. and Mrs. Otter here with Canary, there's something that you have to make a decision on. That is a go, no go, or judgment call decision. So you're deciding if you're able to promote something, or you're deciding if you're able to roll back something. So with Dr. Evil, you're going to promote something, or Ludicrous, you're going to roll back. That's actually very difficult because you're actually doing another deployment. Open-ended question for those on the phone here or on the webinar. Usually when you're deciding to do a Canary, you also have to like clearly bake in what a rollback scenario has to be. It's almost like a faux pas type of word, right? Up until recently, like we might have talked about rollbacks, like, okay, what's your backout strategy? How do we go about making a change? But we've never actually tested rolling back unless we have to, right? Like that's always the funny part. As quintessential as having a rollback might be, you actually don't test it. And so like you're actually banking on a rollback potentially happening with the Canary deployment. And that's part of the challenge. Also, it's just how do you end up promoting something, right? Like what are your success metrics? People would bicker over that all the time saying, we need to do all whiz bang, all big bang at one time. Just assigning the judgment call, we always see that as the hardest issue because usually it's kind of a manual process, right? So you're looking at, we're all a team here again and we're deploying something. It takes us a long time to make the call, right? So we have the benefit of using other tools like APM tools, like tracing tools, monitoring tools. But again, that kind of decision, it's like, hey, finger to the air, is it working well? And that's it. Also, the problem or the hardship with using that type of deployment mechanism. So having a roll back or a roll forward strategy can be very difficult also. So here we have RFL copter, it's rolling around, but that becomes quite difficult when you make the decision. Like, do we continue to move forward? Do we continue to move back? And so taking the Canary out of the equation, we also interview people saying, okay, if there was a problem in production, right? What is your course of action? Are you going to roll forward or are you going to roll back? So for definition, rolling back is going back to the last known stable version of the application. So we'll use the Canary and Otter again. If you're deploying version 1.1 of the application and version 1.0 was stable and something ended up happening, you would tend to roll back, right? To at least restore, because there's a couple of rationale reasons why you want to go back. If you're looking at pure metrics such as MTTR, mean time to resolution. Rolling back is actually a restore, right? So you restore the service versus where we see the split. 85% of organizations favor a rollback. And then 15% of organizations we talk to actually favor a roll forward. And so what is a roll forward? You're actually going to try to fix in place, right? Like, okay, you know what, if there was a problem, a bullshit of organizations would immediately go back to restore the service. But for 15% of organizations, they're saying, no, the feature velocity is important to us. So you're trading off velocity for restoration. So whichever is more important to your organization. So rolling forward actually require a patch. Now you could be argumentative that saying, hey, rolling forward is actually, you're making other versions, so version 1.2 is coming out. So did you actually roll back and roll forward? But that's typically the breakdown that we typically see. I was a little bit ahead of myself. So like, I think this is core to the metrics, right? Like, are you looking at velocity or are you looking at MTTR? And so here we have a Porsche, it's broken down versus it's going really fast. So talking back to some of my more application owner type days, here about harder back to the bank. The irony of the situation is like when you go about deploying something, it's, we deal in systems, right? And we always think that, these particular systems are very objective. Hey, we're software engineers, we're DevOps engineers, we're platform engineers. We're dealing with very objective measure. But when you're looking at a rollback situation, a lot of subjective measure comes in, right? So for me, I, as an application owner, as a dev manager, I was bonused on getting features into production. So if we had to roll back, well, that means my feature was not in production. And so I would really have to like negotiate with, my VP, right? Like, hey, like that, there's an issue. We violated an SLA, the functionality is still there, but we're going to peel back something. And that's it, right? Like always fine tuning. And that's why a bulk share organizations might go back to the MTTR saying, okay, we don't know how long it would take us to fix, but we do know how long something would take us to restore. So if we talk about restore, very good segue here. So like if we actually talk about how long did it take an average organization once they decided to roll back, if the pitcher didn't give it away, the average time to restore once the rollback decision was made was 60 minutes, right? So going back from our Canary to Otter example, if Canary was any good and we decided to go to the stable Otter, it's about an hour it takes the average enterprise for an average application to undeploy, redeploy, and kind of validate that the previous stable version is up. Which, when you think about it, like rollbacks are fairly complicated, right? Like it's not, if in theory they're easy, yeah, just redeploy the last version of the application. Well, there's a lot of steps that are involved. If it took you that long, like if it's like a half a week of preparation to go and deploy something, it certainly will take some time. I actually was impressed with this amount of time it took, because most of the rollbacks I've been, it was several hours, right? Like we might have rolled back, but we had to continue to validate, continue to fix, continue to check if there was any systemic problems. There's been a few times that I've like programmatically corrupted something because we had an error in the logic. And so we have to programmatically back things out. But again, like the average enterprise, given an average application, that restore time is 60 minutes, which we have saw a wide gamut of that. And here's an interesting statistic, which, it might be a little bit of disheartening, but hey, you know what? A lot of times in the software world, we're dealing with things for the very first time, right? So it's the first time we're doing innovation work. You're bound to mess up somewhere. Hey, it's if we were doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, it would be a boring job, right? We're either introducing new technology, introducing new features, run a new team. But 11% of deployments that head to prod, they fail at some point, right? Which as much rigor as you have, there's still the rationale that things will fail, right? And this is folks who before so with this 11% deployment, this is usually what we see. These questions are like, hey, before you're making a heavy investment in tooling for continuous delivery, what is your typical failure rate? And that's 1 out of 10, right? Which no one wants to be in that scenario, but that's also very substantial. You have a 1 in 10 chance of failing. And here's Eddie Murphy saying, if you can never fail testing if you go straight to prod. How do you know? This go ahead and deploy it in production, right? But that's it, right? Like part of the big emphasis we have at the continuous delivery foundation here is that, you know, if you're have the ability to know contractually like what is expected of you as you go through a pipeline, you have a much better chance of your deployment not failing, or your deployment failing earlier in these SDLC. So you're able to make remedy, and also you have a lot more confidence going into your deployment. So question, you know what, here we get to the what can you do about some of these metrics? You either want to deploy more, you want to have more confidence, you want to deploy with more success. Like what are some steps that you could do? And so my advice is actually starting small, right? And so as Smokey the Bear would say here, you have to start somewhere, right? Like trying to it's as cliche as a business example as this might sound. You actually don't want to boil the ocean. That's fairly difficult. Or like, you know what, if we get this one out, if you're a DevOps engineer, or if you're some sort of platform engineer, if we're able to get the most complicated application onto this particular pipeline, we have solved the problem for 80%. So the 80-20 argument. Well, that could be very difficult, right? It's at another talk I give, I'm giving a talk, so Getting to a Yes is like a book by like William Bury, like every consultant reads it, How to Get a Yes. And having incremental success is important, right? So if you're able to shave off a little bit of time somewhere, or able to document something a little bit better, or having a more consistent process, hey, like more power to you, you know? Like if you're going from deploying every 6 months to deploying every 3 months, that's huge. You've doubled the throughput on your team potentially, right? Also, really figuring out where are you least confident is the irony of this all. So for any sort of DevOps moniker, you'll hear the people, process, and technology argument, or not argument, but moniker a lot. And where are you least confident? And this is what we've typically seen. So as people, you know, we're actually, we see the confidence less in the people aspect of it. So the technology and process aspect of it, technology, fairly easy to be confident. I'll give you an example. Let's say we're deploying into Kubernetes, or we're deploying into some sort of cluster. You might say, you know what, Ravi, we have 5 nodes. And so we can concurrently take 2 failures, right? So if we're doing maintenance and then a failure occurs, so we still have 2 available nodes, or 3, depending on how you do the math. Like we have enough nodes to sufficiently handle the process if there's a maintenance and a failure, or 2 concurrent failures. So do things in 5s. That's what I learned. So your technology is confident. Process-wise, absolutely. We have several people. We have both Marcuses on this call have to sign off on something. Sorry, I just like to talk about the Marcuses. So both Marcuses have to sign off on something here. We are super confident in our Marcus technology. Okay, fair. You know, you have a change control board. You have several people reviewing it. You have to validate all your test suites. You just stick in a ServiceNow ticket. Sure, but all of that is driven by the one at the top, which is us. We're emotional, right? We're humans. We're the sum total of our experiences. You know, we have different perspectives. If we were to ask poll people on this call, like, hey, like, how do you think we should do something? Because each one of you are very smart, and each one of you are highly skilled. Like, you each have your own opinion, right? Like, you know, you've done stuff before. You might say, you know what, this worked, this didn't work, and then we all get together and we have a kumbaya moment, and that's it. And usually it's the people aspect of it, like, hey, just turning out why are these approvals in place? Like, why do we need this? And that's where you want to start building the foundation on, right? Also, using a pipeline of a system of record. So going back to that people part of it, a lot of times what ends up happening is that we're not one place forever, right? We're people. We get another job, we go to another project. You know, part of our skill set as engineers, we want to get another domain experience, we want different tool sets until we move on, right? That's how we build our tool sets. And so what ends up happening, going back to like probably the dozen teams I've been on throughout my career, we've always deployed things differently, right? Like my background's been Java. So, you know, I've been writing Java for over 15 years now. And Java's Java, you know, design patterns, paradigms, they're similar. You know, their syntax might change, or additional features, functionality might come on, but I'm able to carry that with me when I go to different places. Every single organization I've been to deploys differently. Like, and as critical as odd as that sounds, like, definitely make an investment in some sort of pipeline technology, right? So being part of the CDF, there are lots of pipeline technologies you can choose from. You know, we have a couple of special interest groups trying to make sure that we call things the same, which is our interoperability special interest group, which you can join if you'd like to join. But having a pipeline is a system of record, which usually what ends up happening not like if you were tasked to deploy something for the first time, it gets fairly tricky, right? Like this is where the people aspect comes in. So let's say I'll pretend Jacqueline's a senior engineer on the team here. So like if I was doing a deployment for the first time, Jacqueline has a lot of intrinsic knowledge of the application, saying, okay, Ravi, like, yeah, like, you know what, this is normal, this is not normal. And I have no idea, right? Like I have an easy feeling like, why are there 1,000 warnings in our, JBoss logs? why is this less large? And Jacqueline will calm me down and say, yeah, don't worry, we always see that. But that's it, right? Having a systemic place of record so you can go back and look at something has helped you learn. Kind of look at what's ran before and look at what hasn't ran before. Looking at what's run before and what's successful and not successful is quite important. And also, since teeing us up here to CDF, so kind of coming at the back end of the presentation here, is that, hey, use the CDF as a way to learn, right? So the continuous delivery foundation. I've being in this industry now, like I haven't seen so many organizations come together for a common goal of helping you deploy more successfully, deploy easier. And so definitely leverage resources like the CDF. Very meta, right? I'm on a CDF webinar talking about the CDF and preaching about the CDF. It doesn't get any more meta than that. But use the CDF for that, right? Hey, great resources, great webinars, great blog posts, and just here to teach and here to help people. And then kind of like lastly, coming at the end of it, if you would like to get a copy of continuous delivery insights, this presentation is it's in the shared drive for the CDF, so you can kind of take a look at it, go through it. And also if you go to harness.io, long name / continuous -delivery -insights -2020 -ebook, that is a long slug. You get a full copy of the report we put together, which is about 25 pages of tooling, where people fall in certain categories. But with that, I think was pretty much most of the presentation that I did have. Certainly open for questions, certainly open for discussion. Thank you everybody for coming today. Let's see, for Ian. So,
hey everyone, everyone's allowed to speak. I've enabled everybody. Since we're a small group, I'd love it to be more of a discussion. So feel free to just unmute yourself and chat away.
Yeah, I can read Ian. I can read your question too, man. So Ian asked, so one of the biggest questions I have is how have you seen the challenges changing in 2020 and where do you see it changing next year? I think what even surprised me when talking to people like all through like the year that we were running this was actually the amount of effort that it takes. Like this is going back to imposter and fear of missing out. I'm surprised that people are deploying so much given like it takes so long to deploy, which was the irony of the situation. Like we talk to certain companies that it's like, you know what, we have one DevOps engineer per pipeline because we will deploy faster, right? And so seeing that resources would be kind of thrown at the problem, which can be good, right? Like, hey, we have a lot of resources, a lot of human power behind this, but it wasn't very scaling, right? Saying like, hey, how, to get to those two, if I was a I'll put on my technology leadership hat. Let's say I got promoted a couple times and I'm the VP of like software engineering. I'm sorry or congratulations if you're working on my team. It would be a good team, right? I might be like, we have to deploy every 2 weeks just because like it is what it is. This is if we're not doing it, we're not hitting any sort of marks. And it's like, what would it take? Or vice versa, I'll role play. Ian, you're my boss, and you told me that, right? So like, I'm like, oh boy. And so that's what we're saying. Like the amount of resources that are being dedicated to it is surprising. Like it is quite an important problem to solve. How is it challenging happening in the next year? I think it's just as there's more emphasis on pipeline development, right? Like, hey, it's, if you don't have a pipe, like my father would say, playing the lottery, if you don't have a lottery ticket, you don't have a chance. Well, if you don't have a pipeline, you don't have a chance. I think you're just wading through all of that. If you take a look at, there's a lot of choice that you have, if you're taking a look at any sort of cloud native stack, right? I think where the challenges and changes are going to be, there'll be more emphasis on pipelines. I'll give you an example. So like, if you follow like our parent organization, the Linux Foundation, and take a look at like the CNCF, the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, every year, there's more and more cards, like there's a landscape there. And so there's more and more choice for us to use the technologist, but there's also a lot more opportunity for us to get told no, right? Like, hey, I'll put devil's advocate. Let's say, Ian, you're my boss. Ian, I want to use Istio. And you're like, well, why, Ravi? Why do you want to use that service mesh? You're like, It's cool. But there's a lot of like fundamental operational problems that we've had in the last couple of decades. Like you want to make sure you can upgrade, you want to make sure it's resilient, you want to make sure you can test it, you want to make sure you have skill set to do those type of things, have not gone away. We just have more technology, right? And so I think if you start looking at like shifting challenges, it might be more for those particular projects. Like if I was, let's say pretend I was on the Istio project, might want to give you some sort of CRD to say, hey, I have a package way for you to deploy something now that any one of these CD tools can deploy, right? So hopefully that was a very long-winded answer. I think that people are definitely putting a lot of effort into it. So it's a very important problem. But the number of technical choices that we're seeing, folks probably will be more alluding to give you like a pipeline to run, right? Saying, oh, don't worry, you know what, how we package something up in Kubernetes, but also give you this in a particular pipeline to run. I kind of sense that happening already.
Yeah, that was really helpful. One of the things that I guess I've seen in my organization here, Autodesk and others, is I know Amazon's like put up is like that 11.7 seconds every developer is deploying to production, or a deployment's going out. One of the challenges I guess that I see, and I kind of want to hear your opinion on, is well, Amazon and the Netflixes of the world and the Microsofts and Googles of the world are there, and even with Harness, it's still the internal frictions that have to go through about like, hey, how does a dev go from code commit to making sure it's validated and tested and that it actually is safe to deploy? Just wondering in terms of like how you can measure the velocity, or look at thinking about how we can deploy with speed and safety, and if you see any trends changing around safety being more important than speed, or speed being an enabler to safety. Or if anything you heard about from your customers or your survey results.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's like I give you like an SRE-ish answer, reliability engineering type of answer. It's like, who is your customer? Like it's a very intrinsic question. Like who is your customer? There's like an internal versus external customer argument, right? So like not sure of your role at Autodesk, but like let's say you were on a platform engineering team, like typically you would be like, we have an internal customer first mantra, because if our internal customers are happy, like the development team, that means they're more successful to appease the external customers, which brings in the money, or vice versa, right? And just determining what is success for that, like every organization is totally different. Like if an insurance company and a financial services institution would be inherently more risk adverse than a software company, like just because you're dealing with like people's lives and monies, right? So as an engineer, you have I would say you have not a civic duty, but a moral duty to uphold certain things, right? And so kind of getting to the heart of that question, it's like, it depends on the org. Do you value safety or do you value agility? And people would say we want both. We want the cake and to eat it too, which is actually fairly possible, right? One of the hardest things to get right though is this process. So when I was at AppDynamics, I was a development manager at AppDynamics. And so it's so funny, like we were actually looking at modernizing some of our pipelines that we had to actually do open source security testing, right? So like we're adding additional security safety to our development pipeline. And I was like one of like 3 dev managers that were like, hey, like let's come together and like kumbaya and do this. It actually took a long time to figure out the process. Like I was able to write a bunch of mock applications and like kind of say, hey, these are tool selection that we have to do. But getting that wired into the process, like it was a bunch of bickering at that point. Like, it's like, well, why do you want to do this here? Why is it so slow here? Why is this faster? And so it's like, it just shows emphasis on, it's people are gonna have to weigh both of those. Depending on your organization, if it's getting it right the first time, like there's an irony of it. Like Facebook's, I know I'm giving you a long-winded answer just so like excited to talk about it. If you hear like Facebook, like, oh, to move fast and break things, there's a very interesting like TechCrunch article out there. Like the people who move fast and break things forgot. Like it was like the banking sector in New York. Like no, we're not gonna move fast and break things, because we have like let's say you're Bank of America and you run their check cashing application, which they process $1 trillion. I know the number in checks a year. We're like we're not going to cause the economy to stop because people can't cash a check, right? And so like it all depends on the organization. People want both, but you need to be realistic at some point. Hopefully that was just my
yeah, very very helpful. Both is hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff. Is there any more questions from our friends? We can talk about anything. One of my I recently saw an article that Dairy Queen has a new pinata blizzard coming out. I'm not sure if anybody's seen that. It has like cake
Really,
inside
that's
it.
the best advice you've given on this webcast. That's awesome.
I was like, a little bit disheartened with all the current stuff going on, and then I saw like this like delicious.com article. It's called the pinata blizzard, and I had to share it with all my friends. Like, there's like cake batter and like candy hearts and like all sorts of like, it's like a cake and a pinata in one. It
Sounds
probably
like the
doesn't
perfect
look like,
recipe for COVID. So,
absolutely, yeah. My friend, she's a dentist. She's like, we're gonna make a lot of money off the kids now for the cavities. It's gonna happen. It's like, brush your teeth. Like,
I don't know if you guys have a Sonic in your area, but Sonic also is like announcing their cake batter blizzards.
oh yeah. Oh, here it is.
so there's a question in the queue from Marcus.
Oh, sorry.
Have you seen any success in automated rollback based on metrics? What are the issues you believe or have seen holding back adoption of fully automated rollback with rollback based on metrics?
Yeah. Okay. So great question. So like, it really depends on like there is like a partially like tooling will have to come into like to this. I'll start at the very top. Every application, depending on how stringent like your platform engineering practices, every application will have different metrics, right? So like, it's a very hard question to get right. I'll put, since Ian's on the call, like Ian and I are in two different teams. And so Ian's application has completely different metrics than my application. So like what you might take a generic approach, I'll just pretend, Marcus, you're like a platform engineer, right? Like, or you're running like that organization. So you would have to start like with generics, then get specific or domain specific. So like you might say at a bare minimum of, let's say we're, I'm going to use Dairy Queen. I'm looking at their pinata blizzard right now online. So like, let's say we're rolling out this pinata blizzard, and at a bare minimum, if the application doesn't even come up, you have to roll back, right? Like you might start with very severe type of things, and then get specific. Because any sort of monitoring tool or metricing tool, like it's quite easy to see that. Versus like if there's like a regression, like there might be some more generics. Like how do you know when you're violating an SLA, right? Like Ian's app is different than my app. Like if you might violate an SLA that I don't, or vice versa. And so just understanding that, then you get more domain specific. When you start getting more domain specific, there's like this is where the tooling conversation kind of comes in. Like, hey, if you're using a tool that knows that, like an APM tool, like a New Relic or an App Dynamics, like inferring for those, like using those tools for what they're good for, like they have a lot more domain knowledge of the application. And so it's basically tying that into place. I think that's actually the biggest part. Like why, let me go back a couple slides. Slide. Oh, went back too far. That is actually the biggest part when we talk to people, like how do we know when to roll back? Because why are we investing in the Canary? We're just investing in another deployment. Or if you have multiple phases, like each one of those phases, like if you go from 80-20 to 50-50 to 0-100, right, being that's the stable Canary ratio there. It's a deployment every time, and so like that's pretty big. And I think that would be the biggest part. Like tooting my own horn for a second, like at Harness, like that's the biggest problem we see people having. It's like we don't know how to automate that, right? Like, hey, we can get very close to that, but it's every monitoring tool is different, measuring tool is different, and that's just early tooling. Like the CDF is, several projects have stuff like that kind of talk to that at different different levels. But yeah, that's the big problem. Hopefully that answered your question.
I would just mention one of the things for us with automated rollbacks we've seen is that from the APM tooling or even from the metrics, pulling humans out of the system makes it really hard because the system rollbacks always. And so much like Skynet, we're finding that it's killing our deployments, and it's because there's a human judgment factor that's involved, and it's almost too sentient to say you're going to decrease your reliability because some CPU metrics changing, some memory metrics changing. And we're trying to get the fine tuning of that understanding so that the system doesn't automatically say every new deployment is less stable than the last deployment.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's really hard. It gets into like baselining, right? Like what you're talking about there. So like, if you took like the pipeline out of the equation and like, let's say we'll switch gears. Let's say we were like SREs. So we are the reliability team. Yeah, that's it. Getting a baseline is always like tricky, and having that kind of knowledge just takes time. Like it takes you time to get a baseline. It's about coverage at some point too. Like this is my like soapboxy talk. Like it's core to like the movie company in Los Gatos or the book company, South Lake Union. The rationale behind them deploying so quickly is that they have it's this new moniker of a full lifecycle developer, right? Or if you write it, you run it. I'm actually I have a very dissenting opinion against that type of model. Always curious to hear what people have to say about that, but they have to have a very strong, very strong platform engineering practice, right? Like, hey, we have to give you a prescription because we need a common way of us ingesting the metrics. We need a common way of you deploying because we need to be able to make judgment calls on your behalf too. And like, yeah, similar to your thing, right? Like the Skynet sentient being, you kind of have to build that up a little bit to a point. I think where it gets a little bit difficult, it's like having each team infer what they need. It's like, I'll play devil's advocate. Let's say I was on a dev team at Autodesk. I'm like, okay, Ravi, for you to be, to have a lower risk category for us, you have to use a set of tools, right? We need, I'll just name some tools. Like you need to be using FluentD for trace. You need to be using Prometheus for metrics. Like if your application has those hooks, like, yeah, you're in a lower risk category for us. And so we'll provide you support on that, which is difficult to do, right? Like, it's always like, it's choice versus innovation. And it's like how much guardrails you want to give versus how much you want to give freedom. Every organization is different. I like guardrails. I use bumpers when I bowl because I want to get a better score, but everybody's a little bit different.
So you shared the Pinata blast. I wanted to share a funny link that's about how you produce your CI/CD pipeline. And it just hit a home far too frequently. Oh, that's an awesome. Oh, dude, I'm totally in that blizzard. But that
let's check it out.
Link I shared is great.
Yeah, let's see I never saw it before.
So if you scroll down, you'll see this diagram, and it basically says, for CI/CD pipeline, you test, you build, you deploy dev, manual tweaks, forget about the tweaks, wait for change approval, more tweaks, heat death of the universe, escalate to director, change approval, unset unseen, wait for 3-year maintenance window, deploy to prod. Everything works. Just kidding. Why would any of this work? Errors, 50% conference call, many manual tweaks, and this is the one that at least hits home to me the most. Prod returns to an acceptably broken state. And then, of course, you add your LinkedIn skills, DevOps, automation, and troubleshooting. So
that's so funny. Yeah. If it's running, it's running. Yeah, this has the feels. Cool. Yeah, I'll share this. This picture out to some of my buddies. This is a good share. Man, anything else, buddies? Before we kind of wrap up, I can leave it on.
That's awesome.
People are watching the video. Good. Jack was like, "I'm gonna have to cut this out."
Oh no, I love it. I don't care. I mean, this is the fun part of having these little reunions with the community. We get to just have fun.
It's not gonna